In this, the third of a 5-program series dealing with the theme of revolution in Latin America, we examined the two major revolutions of this century, those of Mexico and Cuba. So far we've studied the image of Latin America presented in our media and have shown how superficial it is. In particular, we studied the appalling living conditions for the vast majority of Latin America's 370 million people. The second program provided a historical framework examining the nearly 400 years between the discovery and conquista to the earth-shattering Mexican Revolution, which burst forth in 1910. We saw that life had scarcely changed for the poor, who by 1915 accounted for almost 90% of Latin America's population during the 3 centuries of colonial administration under the Spanish. Even after the independence from Spain in the early 19th century, and in fact until the Mexican Revolution, little was done to improve life for the peasants, who had been the cannon fodder during the wars. In this third program, we will look closely at 2 case histories, namely Mexico in 1910 and Cuba in 1959, to determine precisely why revolution broke out in those countries. The many complex causes of the Mexican Revolution can only be understood if we realize just how little the social situation had changed in Latin America during this 400-year period. Once again, we see the musical chairs phenomenon at the top as rival generals and politicians vied for control. For virtually everybody else, however, time virtually stood still. Indeed, Mexico in 1910 can be seen as a scaled-down model of all the social ills afflicting Latin America, this long-standing frustration. Its peasant leaders, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, had the fundamental goal of returning the land to the peasant. An astonishing 96.9% of rural families were landless in 1910 in Mexico. He also wanted the masses to have some say in the running of the country, the very same goals they had fought for 100 years later under Father Hidalgo. To a large extent, the popular outburst known as the Mexican Revolution was due to the dictatorial rule of President Porfirio Diaz, who, following unsuccessful attempts to be elected in 1867 and 1872, led a military coup. With the exception of a few years, he would rule Mexico with an iron hand until 1911, practicing what academics call with tongue-in-cheek Diaz-patism. His rule can be typified by the Spanish expression pan o palo, literally bread or the club, which boiled down to this simple formula: you take what I give you, the bread, or you get beaten with the club. His base of support was the army. He had been a general, and a loosely organized militia of former bandits, the rurales, who roamed the country terrorizing at will. If any important landowners needed assistance in keeping the peasants in line, he simply called on these rural shock troopers of Diaz. The situation was soon resolved. Of course, it was totally impossible to change the political system democratically. The Congress was a mere showcase, which Diaz despectively termed "my herd of horses." As in the case of so many Latin American countries today, the president was an institution who was either replaced by a coup or by death. The peasants, as we can see in this work by Rivera, were pushed aside to make room for the gente decente, literally decent people, for whom the impressive buildings in Mexico City at the time were intended. If Diaz's heavy-handed and often brutal political approach alienated his people, the same can also be said of his economic and social policies. He is reputed to have uttered the famous phrase, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States," after seeing how his attempts to develop the national economy had benefited the foreign investors. What is clearly true is that under Diaz, U.S. ownership rose astronomically, and that by the outbreak of the revolution in 1910, a group of 8 powerful foreigners owned some 55 million acres, much of it along the U.S. border. As a result both of the traditional Latin American inferiority complex and a lack of technical know-how, the Diaz government encouraged foreign investors to flock to Mexico. Soon, however, foreign investment was controlling mining, railroads, utilities, banking, and commerce. As we can see in slides of Mexico today, the US presence is still very noticeable. This wouldn't have been so bad if Mexican citizens had been treated fairly. However, this did not prove to be the case. Mexicans working alongside foreigners were generally paid 1/2 of what the foreigners received. Upper and middle positions were generally reserved for foreigners, upsetting both workers and middle-class businessmen alike. The most brutal example, however, of this preferential treatment was the large-scale stealing of fertile Indian land in the northern state of Sonora, to be sold then to European and North American homesteaders. When the Indians resisted, the Mexican army intervened, massacring the Yaqui tribe. Those who survived this Holocaust were then sent to the Yucatan Peninsula to work on the henequen plantations as forced labor. It is little wonder then that the Diaz government is generally seen as the stepmother of Mexicans and the mother of foreigners. At the lower social levels, by far the largest part of the population, conditions were dreadful. In the countryside, the haciendas had continued to eat up the communal Indian territories, with the end result that by 1910, more than 96% of rural families were landless. Debt peonage, with all debts passing from generation to generation to be worked off, was still widespread. Living conditions were so appalling that a US Senate report of the time concluded that contract laborers, quote, were slaves to all intents and purposes, unquote. Workers were often paid by their employees not in money but in tokens, which could be exchanged only at the company store, where they paid exorbitant prices for goods. In the cities, as Philip Russell has indicated in his excellent study, Mexico in Transition, the industrial workers also lived in a desperate situation. They worked an average of 12 to 14 hours daily and were forbidden by law from striking. By 1910, some 16% of Mexico City's population were sleeping in the streets. The vast majority were eating less agricultural products than they had been some 35 years earlier. For campesinos, the situation was even more desperate. Their salaries had not increased in almost 100 years. The background conditions then for revolution were clearly present. The only thing missing was a spark, which would soon come in the shape of Francisco Madero, seen here on the left, a remarkably unlikely revolutionary. Not only was he small in stature, mild-mannered, a poor speaker and a spiritist, he was also from one of Mexico's wealthiest landowning families. When, in 1908, Porfirio Diaz told the US reporter Creelman that, 32 years after taking power, he would not run in the 1910 elections, Madero decided to stand as a presidential candidate. His campaign was fabulously popular, and it appeared that he would be a clear winner against Diaz, who changed his mind at the last minute and decided to run after all. The night before the election, Diaz, fearing a loss at the polls, had Madero and hundreds of his campaign workers arrested and jailed. He stuffed the ballot boxes. According to official figures, Diaz won, receiving millions of votes, while Madero received a ludicrous 196 votes. Unfortunately, these crude tactics are commonplace in Latin America, as can be seen from General Batista's takeover in Cuba in 1952, or last year's farce in Bolivia, where the military refused to allow the electoral winner, Siles Suazo, to assume the presidency. A popular cry went up at the chicanery. Mexican landlords and workers alike felt offended by Diaz's strong-arm tactics, and of course hoped that their social and economic conditions would improve under a new president. After Diaz was overthrown in 1911, the future indeed looked rosy. Unfortunately, it was not meant to be, largely because of Madero's weak presidency. He was convinced that political reform would be the solution to all of Mexico's problems, and preached tirelessly the need for a calm legislative solution. Democracy, effective suffrage, no re-election were his slogans. There's a famous anecdote of Madero and his wife riding triumphantly into Mexico City to the cries of "Viva la democracia," and a peasant, unaware of the meaning, meaning of the word, asking if that was the wife's name. This, of course, was little comfort to the millions living close to starvation or those wanting to continue the revolution's radical goals. Peasant leaders such as Pancho Villa in the north and Emiliano Zapata in the south called upon Madero to allow the campesinos to take back their land. Indeed, as the revolutionaries later claimed, if Huerta had not destroyed Madero, they would have had to do so because of Madero's ultra-legalistic solutions. During a revolution, they claimed, you were supposed to act in a revolutionary way. Things were rapidly coming to a head when General Huerta, in much the same way as Chile's General Pinochet, took the initiative and, aided by Porfirio Diaz's nephew Felix and U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, overthrew the government of Madero. The president and his vice president, Pino Suarez, were arrested and executed. The second round of the revolution then began. After much fierce infighting, an unusual and highly disparate coalition of hacienda owners under Carranza and Obregón and peasant revolutionaries, Villa and Zapata, successfully overthrew General Huerta. It appeared, as in Madero's initial success, that victory had been won. This, however, was not to be. Infighting then broke out among the victors and continued for the next decade. In all of this senseless killing, the Fiesta of Bullets, as it's often called, an estimated 1 million people lost their lives and are commemorated in this monument to the revolution in Mexico City. The noble ideals of the revolution were pushed further and further to the background. Some 40 years after the armies of Zapata and Villa marched triumphantly into Mexico City, a young defense lawyer, Fidel Castro, launched a suicidal attack against the second largest military garrison in Cuba, the Moncada Barracks, located in Santiago de Cuba. Castro was arrested and after 2 years was freed to go into exile in Mexico, where he and his brother Raúl met an Argentine physician, Ernesto Che Guevara. They bought a boat, the Granma, now a historical monument in Havana, and set out with some 80 men, arriving in Cuba in late 1956. There then followed 2 years of intense fighting, culminating in President Batista's flight from the presidential palace on December 31st, 1958, so vividly documented in the first sections of the film Godfather Part 2. The rest is all history. The landing in Cuba was a complete fiasco. The boat became stuck in a swampland. Batista's Air Force cut down the revolutionaries as they clambered from the boat. Of the original invasion force of some 80 men, only a dozen or so survived and carried on the struggle in the Sierra Maestra mountain range. Given this unlikely beginning for a massive social revolution, how did the Cuban Revolution come about? Of prime importance was the character of Fidel Castro himself and the mythology of the bearded ones, which quickly sprung up, particularly in rural areas.
El valor de la producción del millón de jóvenes estará por encima de todo el costo de la educación. Aunque el costo de la educación sobrepase los 1.000 millones de pesos en el año 80. Y no que esto es en el orden cuantitativo, pero está el orden cualitativo.
The peasants were treated remarkably well by the revolutionaries. Schools were set up to teach the children. Rudimentary medical care was given to the peasants, mainly by Che Guevara, an asthma specialist, and just compensation was paid for all livestock taken. This in an area where the military traditionally robbed and brutalized the peasants obviously made an impression on the country dwellers. It is no accident that so many people in these rural areas flocked to join the revolutionaries. The geographical setting is worth noting. Oriente province, where Castro landed, apart from being his natal province, was also the furthest from the capital, Havana. Given this distance, it meant that Oriente was the most neglected area, with the greatest level of social injustice being found there. In the cities, Fidel Castro was already well known. Among other exploits, he had been president of the Law School Students' Union at the University of Havana. And in 1943 to 1944, had been chosen as Cuba's best all-round school athlete. It is also alleged that he was closely watched by the New York Yankees, who at one point were keen to draft Castro to play baseball. If that had happened, how different would Cuba's history today be? He had also participated in 1947 in an abortive invasion of the Dominican Republic and had been present as a representative of his university's law faculty in Bogota, Colombia, when an angry demonstration had got out of control, resulting in some 3,000 people being killed. Castro had also received much media experience, writing scathing denunciations of government corruption, official cover-ups, and unjust privileges, and also had been the co-host of a popular radio program. So, when Fidel Castro led his first battle campaign on July 26, 1953, against the Moncada garrison, he was reasonably well known in Cuba. Much of Castro's support came from the urban middle class, which was appalled by the brutality of repression practiced by the Batista forces. After the attack on the Moncada garrison, for example, press reports were published on the degree of torture and murder inflicted upon the insurgents. The leading Cuban journal, Bohemia, even published a large number of photographs of bodies that had been dressed in clean clothes to cover torture scars in an effort to convince people that they had been killed fighting. This scandal was proven when labels were noted on the brand new uniforms clothing the corpses. An estimated 80 people captured after the result were badly beaten. 3 were dragged behind a jeep for several miles, and one, Abel Santamaria, after whom Cuba's National Blind School was named, had his eyes gouged out before being killed in jail. The extent of this repression is worth noting. It's generally estimated that some 20,000 people were executed during Batista's reign. That, of course, touches a lot of lives and makes for a lot of potential enemies. These photographs of the so-called model prison, where Fidel Castro and the survivors of the Moncada attack were kept, are worth noting. None of the cells had doors, but the guards in the machine gun nest in the center had orders to shoot on sight any prisoners who dared to move from their cell. While repression on this scale can be a contributing factor to revolution, it requires a generally unhappy population to bring it to fruition. The case of Mexico, as we've seen, rested largely upon an unhappy rural population. By contrast, it's usually understood that Cuba was, in the late 1950s, in a favorable position by Latin American standards. Per capita annual income was the highest in all Latin America, about $500 a year. A building boom was underway in Havana, and thousands of American businessmen flew the 100 miles from Miami to Havana for their business conventions. As Wilbur Clark, who had come from Las Vegas to open a new casino at the Hotel Nacional, said, "The future looks fabulous for Havana." This is only one side of the coin, however, since, as one Cuban saying had it, the third world begins 1 mile outside Havana. In the capital, life was indeed generally very good, particularly if you were wealthy. There was an average of 1 doctor for every 420 people. That compares to 1 for every 900 people in Canada today. There was lots of employment in the service industries, catering to American tourists. One study maintains that there were 11,500 registered prostitutes and 27,000 croupiers in a city the size of Montreal. And 2, there were educational facilities of a kind. Some 30% of children actually attended secondary school, a Latin American record. A tour of Havana's Colón Cemetery shows the wealth enjoyed by some residents of the city. In the country, however, there was a different story. 1 doctor for every 2,550 people in Castro's province, Oriente. Massive unemployment and underemployment for the 7 months following the sugar harvest, and only 7% of rural teenagers attended school. Per capita income might be $500 nationally, but in the country it was $91. In his defense speech in 1953, Fidel Castro examined this tragic situation, explaining how in his hometown children walked around without shoes, unemployment continued almost 4 times the national average, and poverty was widespread. Before anything else, he maintained, the balance had to be righted in the favor of the peasants. In the countryside, the situation was bad. More than 75% of the houses, or bohíos, were huts with mud floors, thatched roofs, and bird dung to fill the cracks. The 1953 government census classified 75.2% of these as ruinoso, ruinous or worthless. Only 9% had electricity. 2% had inside piped water. More than 54% had no regular sanitary facilities. So much for the future looking fabulous for Cuba. Medical care was available for a price in the cities, but in the countryside there was a very different picture. According to a 1950 survey, very few rural families could afford medical aid. The hospitals, anyway, were situated in the city. The results were predictable. More than 13% suffered from intestinal parasites, 14% had already suffered from tuberculosis, and 13% from typhoid fever. An old rural saying put it well: only the cattle are vaccinated in Cuba. While a variety of food was available for a price in Havana, once again the countryside was very different. The agricultural workers' weight was said to be 16 pounds under the national average, and some 35% or more of the population was said to suffer from some form of nutritional deficiency. This isn't all that surprising if we look at what Cubans could afford to eat. Only 4% of the peasants ate meat as a regular part of their diet. Only 1% ate fish. Less than 2% ate eggs. 3% bread. 11% milk. This, you should remember, was in the wealthiest country of Latin America. You can imagine what the rest were like. We have seen how in rural Mexico, the rurales, or Porfirio Diaz's army of former bandits, placed on the government payroll, were rural law enforcers. All sorts of problems resulted from this, as consistently these glorified gangsters robbed from the peasants with impunity and were handsomely rewarded by landowners for keeping their peasants in tow. In Cuba, it wasn't really all that different, and the security forces were remarkably corrupt. The rather poor film Cuba with Sean Connery shows this well, as the police calmly helped themselves to money from parking meters. The urban police were heavily involved with protection rackets, narcotics, gambling and prostitution. In the countryside, police and military did much as they pleased, robbing from the peasants and contracting themselves out to wealthy landowners. Here we see a dramatic reenactment of these activities. In this case, the landlord has decided to kick a rural family off his land, destroy their bohío, or thatched cottage, and plant cane in the area. It doesn't matter if he has a legal or moral right to do this. As in so many things in Cuba, might was right. In the field of education as well, the campesinos received the dirty end of the stick. While the national illiteracy figures showed that 23.5% of the population was illiterate, in the countryside this rose to a disproportionate 52%. Indeed, some 44% of the people in the countryside had never attended school in their lives. Education, then, was something that was denied a large sector of the rural population. As was stated in a US government white paper in early 1961, conditions in Cuba, and I quote, constituted an open invitation to revolution. It had been brewing for many years, and its harnessed energy brought about the most influential single event in 20th century Latin America. A strong dose of economic nationalism, as in the case of Mexico, also fueled much of Cuba's anger. Again, the villains of the piece were rapacious North American interests, which owned a goodly proportion of the Cuban economy. According to the U.S. Commerce Department itself, American participation exceeds 90% in the telephone and electric services, about 50% of public service railways, and roughly 40% in raw sugar production. In addition, 1/4 of all bank deposits were made to Cuban branches of U.S. banks, American interests owned the main cement plant, much of the tobacco industry, 6 of the 15 principal banks, many of the best hotels, the importing and refining of crude oil, and the marketing of petroleum products. Many Cubans were upset that the government of Batista was simply selling out resources cheaply to North American corporations, while he and the economic elite were benefiting. Batista, for example, is reputed to have received a solid gold telephone from a utilities company for services rendered. Little of the advantages, however, were trickling down to the masses, particularly as we've seen in the countryside. In Havana, too, many people were very disappointed with the sordid reputation of the city as the Sin City of the Caribbean, with more croupiers and prostitutes in Havana alone than there were miners throughout the island of Cuba. This is seen very well in Godfather Part 2. If we analyze these two major 20th century revolutions, we can see several recurrent causes, many of which are perhaps equally applicable to today's situation in other Latin American countries. In both Mexico and Cuba, the majority of people suffered in absolutely degrading circumstances, while a minority cozied up to foreign investors and lived a fabulously wealthy existence. Economic nationalism also played a major role, with the people finally rising to assert their independence and opposition to what in Spanish is known as Coca-Cola-ismo. The majority, however, lived in a very familiar poverty. Government brutality too, whether it be the continual harassment of Madero's followers or the butchery of Batista's henchmen, polarized popular opinion, causing people to become involved in the struggle against tyranny. As we've seen in other programs, while some got to enjoy a decent standard of living, the vast majority didn't. Finally, in both cases, the energy of the people rallied around two very different figureheads, both of whom were very well known: Francisco Madero in Mexico and Cuba's Fidel Castro. Both men pursued the basic goals of land, freedom, and food in much the same way as Father Hidalgo in Mexico in 1810 had represented a fresh alternative to the continuing degree of repression. The die was cast in both cases, in Mexico in 1910, Cuba in 1959. The catalyst of their leadership set off a chemical reaction whose effect can still be seen in Latin America.